So, hello to all the good people of the Diocese of Reno, from the good people of Queen of Peace Parish in Salem, Oregon. I'm Father Ray Carey, a priest of the Archdiocese of Portland, and very happy to be here and happy to be with you on the topic of the art of forgiveness. You know, in Matthew 18, verse 22, Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, how often do I have to forgive my brother or sister? 7 times?" And Jesus responds, "No, Peter, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times," which is to say, infinitely. It's at the very heart of being a follower of Jesus Christ, to learn the art of forgiveness. Quite some time ago, I was doing some work in Fiji for the Pacific Seminary for all of the Pacific Rim countries. And there was a little seminarian there, poor as a church mouse, from the Archdiocese of Fiji. And out of nowhere, had nothing whatsoever to do with the topic. He raised his hand and he said, "Father, have you been happy as a diocesan priest?" Which was a pretty clear Rorschach. He's asking, do I have a chance of being happy if I do this? And I gave him an answer that was a spontaneous answer, and I'd give him the same answer tonight. I said to him, I've known happiness as a priest that I didn't know was possible to a person. And I've known sadness as a priest that I didn't realize was possible for a human being. And later on, reflecting on what I had said to him, what seemed clear to me was that the greatest joys that have come in the experience of priesthood have had to do with helping people to reconcile to the Lord, reconcile to their families, to reconcile, in a sense, schizophrenically, to themselves. And the greatest sadness I have known is to see divisions that I've not been able to help them with, to see hatreds that they weren't able to overcome, to see, in short, lack of forgiveness in their lives. And one of the things that seems pretty clear to me is that one of the greatest challenges of our spiritual lives is to accept the reception of God's forgiveness. To recognize that God's forgiveness is greater than my darkness. And once we really steep ourselves in that wonderful grace and gift of forgiveness from our loving God through Jesus, then it becomes easier, having let God do the healing, do the restoring and renewing. It becomes easier, not easy, but easier to become one who forgives. I love what Pope Francis said about this. He said, God never tires of forgiving us. That's God's gracious gift to us. Everything that the church does is linked to Jesus' ministry of reconciliation. And I mean everything that we do is linked to Jesus' ministry of reconciliation. All the sacraments are linked especially to that. Obviously, baptism and confirmation, and also the Eucharist, which is given for the forgiveness of sins, Jesus tells us. The sacrament of reconciliation, encountering the gentle mercy of Christ in a personal way. The sacrament of the healing of the sick, the anointing of the sick, brings with it absolution. Every sacrament participates in the reconciling mercy and ministry of Jesus Christ, including marriage and holy orders. Those are given not privately to people, not for private benefits of people getting married or people being ordained to the diaconate or the priesthood or to the episcopacy. It's given for the building up of the koinonia, of the community of God's beloved people. Everything we do, Catholic education, is linked to the ministry of reconciliation. Jesus was unique as a rabbi in 4 specific ways. Jesus taught 4 things that no rabbi before him had taught. The first of those 4 is he taught the law will not save you, which was revolutionary for a Jewish rabbi. That God's Torah, God's law, first 5 books of the Bible and the commentaries on those. The law will not save you. It is putting your faith that Jesus Christ is the one sent from the living God that will save you. Nobody ever taught that. Jesus also taught that you had to have a personal relationship with God. Primarily and at its best taking place when the koinonia gathers, when the community of God's people gathers to hear the word, to celebrate the sacraments. But our personal relationship with God. The necessity of prayer. As Jesus said, you must pray without ceasing. Nobody ever taught that way before. Likewise, nobody in the history of Rabbinic Judaism taught inclusivity the way that Jesus did. Unparalleled in Rabbinic Judaism. No one in the kingdom of God proclaimed by Jesus Christ is unwelcome to the kingdom. No one is excluded who puts his or her heart open to God's gracious goodness. This is from a religion that survived in large measure by being distanced from the Gentile, by reveling in the privilege of being God's chosen people. What Jesus taught and modeled and did, which nobody had ever done before, was the inclusivity of the welcome to become children of God in a unique and special way. Paul reveled in teaching that we are all children of God, whether by covenant in the Jewish tradition or by adoption through Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The way he included women had not been done in Rabbinic Judaism. The fact that they were part of his company of disciples was not only not done before, it was scandalous to people. In that culture, a woman had to have permission from her husband to go out in public, and then had to have her head covered when she did that. But to be in the company of the closest friends of Jesus, traveling throughout Judea and throughout the Galilee, scandalous. Women are named in the gospel and definitely named in Paul's writings. Inclusivity. No one unwelcome. No one beyond God's loving mercy or forgiveness. The fourth thing that Jesus taught that set him apart from every other rabbi, unheard of, love without limit, mercy without measure. Same thing he taught Peter. 70 times, 7 times must you forgive. Love without limit, mercy without measure. So that whole notion of connecting to a real sense of reconciliation as people who are reconciled and as people whose ministry by baptism is to be reconcilers, to bring people together. Etymologically, reconcilia means eyelash to eyelash. Not exactly a COVID step. We are reconcilers by our baptism. No such thing as a sin or evil that does not need forgiveness or that is beyond God's forgiveness. Unimaginable. I had a powerful experience. We all remember where we were on 9/11. Well, I was up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I was preaching a retreat to the priests of Marquette Diocese. And the towers came down on Monday, the first day of the retreat. Absolutely stunning, of course, shocking, frightening. No one could predict what would happen from there. And one of my thoughts was, well, this retreat's over. You know, it's 40 priests there. They're pastors in Upper Peninsula. Not a priest left that retreat. The agenda changed radically. Not a priest left. And that week was a week of incredible grace. I certainly experienced an anger that I hadn't known before, a deep gut level desire for revenge, wanting to strike back even though we were clearly unaware of the origin of that attack. And I wasn't the only one who had that experience. We all knew that's not Jesus' way. We all knew that's not the way of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And through our prayer together that week, through our discussions, through our conversations, we helped each other approximate reconciling ministry of Jesus Christ. And one of the ways that got right to the marrow of the bone for all of us as priests, we helped each other craft homilies. How shall we approach this with God's people? Whatever do we have to say as preachers of the word to the people of God that have been insulted so radically? By the end of that week, I certainly noticed it in myself, and I heard it in my priestly colleagues. That deep, gut-felt desire for revenge had moved into a healthier place. It had moved into a holier place as well. That's what grace looks like. That's not the work of the priests who were there, certainly not mine. That was God's grace working in us. Nelson Mandela, my goodness, 28 years unjustly convicted and imprisoned. Not in the Taj Mahal either. And unthinkably, when not only that prison sentence ended, but official apartheid ended, and Nelson Mandela is elected president of the country. At his inauguration dinner, He invited his jailer to join him at the head table. What an incredible sign of openness to reconciliation, of openness to the radical meaning of forgiveness. I always loved Gandhi's great line, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." One of the most challenging things about approximating forgiveness is a phenomenon that, in my experience in the field of psychology, is relatively recent, is the phenomenon of rumination. I've had the privilege of being at a number of conventions of psychologists in which papers, research papers on rumination, were presented to the colleagues. Rumination is a major enemy of forgiveness. Rumination means going over and over and over a hurt, a slight, an insult, or worse. You can think of the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Rumination is that response to that just keeps people stuck. They are so angry. They are so feeling vulnerable, so upset about having been so unjustly treated, of being dismissed as a person. Whatever the hurt was, rumination is like a jailer. It keeps you locked in. That you just keep staying stuck in yesterday and your anger about that. I'll never forget, a number of years ago, I was doing a priest retreat. I don't even remember where. And I was spending some time with an older priest. You know, it's a common thing in the retreat. They will take some time with a retreat director. He was having a major problem with his bishop. Boy, when he talked about his bishop, his carotid arteries were popping in his shirt. Angry at whatever the bishop and he had disagreed about. Oh, I remember what it was even. The man had been in the hospital, and while he was in the hospital, the bishop moved him. Reassigned him to another parish. Gosh, you can understand how a person might think, is that really a good timing to do that? But that's what he was so angry about. And I said to him, well, where does it stand now with your bishop? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, what's the last thing that was said in your exchange with the bishop recently? And he said, he died 20 years ago. I said, for God's sake, brother, it's time to punt. Give up the ball. I mean, that's rumination on steroids, isn't it? God bless him. One of the most fascinating things I've ever studied in my work in psychology is physiology, and particularly the physiology of the autonomic nervous system. Very simply put, and I'm going to give you an analogy to it, but very simply put, you get a bee sting or some kind of an injury. There are little white blood cells called phagocytes that rush to that bee sting location. They'll swell it up, they surround it, it'll get red around it and become a bump on your hand or wherever the injury is. And those phagocytes will rush in there and consume that invader so that it doesn't become a systemic problem. And in the process of doing that, they're giving up their lives. Those cells are alive, right? They're white blood cells, giving up their lives in order to prepare a healthier place for the whole system. I remember thinking in my own disordered thinking, God, praise God for that. You could praise God and become a believer just studying physiology. You could also do it studying, archaeology, astrology. You can do it in a lot of ways. But I remember thinking, wow, that's really cool. I wonder why God didn't give us mental phagocytes to chase away these ruminating thoughts, Never thought of that with your phagocytes, did you? You should take them to dinner. You don't even have to send a Valentine to them. They're just there to take care of you. Well, mentally, we need to learn some of those tools as well in order to give away, give up, to destroy the behaviors associated with anger. Anger and rumination prevent forgiveness and ultimately reconciliation. There's two major behaviors that come with anger: retribution and revenge. Retribution is payback. You're looking for a way to get back that whoever has harmed you. Revenge has to do with getting even. Those are behaviors that are counterproductive to forgiveness. And a major step toward forgiveness is giving up those behaviors of anger, retribution, and revenge. Foregoing the impulse for revenge reflects the strength to absorb an injury without being poisoned by it. Foregoing the impulse to revenge makes it possible to prevent being poisoned by the insult that one has received. I'd like to spend a few moments on 5 things that forgiveness is not. And people meaning well, very often, will fall into the axiom, you need to let it go. Like talking to somebody that's had a major hurt, major pain in their lives. I never forget, I was teaching in a master's program in counseling psychology, and I was supervising a client, or a counselor, who was a brand new counselor. And I'm watching the video of a marriage counseling session, first session. And he asked him, what brings you to counseling? Kind of a reasonable question. It's not always with an easy answer. In fact, my experience has been it rarely is an easy answer. But then they said to him variations of, we just can't talk to each other. We just can't express ourselves to each other. Communication's a real problem. The next thing the counselor did was to say, well, how do you feel about that? They had just told him they can't express themselves. And he asked them to do what they told him they couldn't do. I said, that's why God made you. You need to teach them how to express themselves. Very often people will say that when a hurt has taken place and you share it with a third party, say, well, you gotta let it go. That's not the first step. That is not the first step. There are 5 things that forgiveness is not. First of all, it's not saying what happened didn't matter. That's not what forgiveness means. Or it's not saying it's all right. I'm thinking of an example of infidelity in a marriage. Boy, that's not all right. That does matter. Forgiveness hasn't got anything to do with it doesn't matter or it's all right. Secondly, forgiveness does not mean endorsement or agreement. Like people very often are afraid if they forgave somebody who injured them, it's almost like telling them, it's okay. It's okay. I may wish with all my heart that you hadn't hurt us, that you hadn't been unfaithful, but I will refuse to condemn you. Forgiveness is not endorsement or agreement. And you know what else forgiveness isn't? It's not a cross given to you by God. You know, the injury that caused that. It's not a cross. God is not in the business of issuing crosses to us. Here's a little something for you. A little flu for you, a little COVID for you. God's not in the cross business. That offends the nature, the reality of the cross of Jesus Christ, which he freely accepted. Forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is not weakness. In my 50 years as a priest working with the folks, it seems to me that guys have more problem with this than women do. I'm prepared to be resoundingly booed out of the planet. But that's my experience. Guys have a harder time with this. Forgiveness is not weakness. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It means you're in charge of deciding how you treat people. You're in charge of it. You're not passively a victim of how other people respond to you. There's some people that go to their graves waiting for an apology that never came. Why would you surrender that power over yourself? Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's in fact real strength. I'll share a story with you, and many of you may have heard this. I apologize, but it's an insincere apology. I give it to you, though. Many, many years ago, I was working on the East Coast in a convent of sisters, doing some presentations, celebrating sacraments, and so forth. At any rate, there was a sister in that group of 40 or 50 sisters who was about my age, who was among the rudest human beings I think I had ever encountered. And I'm an old teacher. I know about rudeness. I mean, my goodness, she just couldn't, unless she were in Delta sleep, have manifested greater boredom. She shook her head, disagreeing with, things like, it's Thursday. No, I don't think so. It's like, disagreed with everything. And I just couldn't put my finger on, what did I say that upset her? What did I do that upset her? This is over a period of several days. By the time of the third day in my hotel room before I went to the conference, I'm thinking, what can I say to upset her? And I'm thinking, lady, don't screw around with me. I make a living with a microphone, and I'm an old English teacher. I have words you haven't heard yet. And I'm picturing, things to say to her that would, really bring her down to a level of non-arrogance. And one of the last things I was thinking was, thank you for your warm hospitality. Should you ever come to Oregon, I'd be delighted to welcome you in the same way. Yeah, like a dagger in the rib, Then it dawns on me, I'm in the shower in the hotel. it dawns on me. What are you doing? What are you doing? She does not decide how you treat people. I decide how I treat people, not her. It was like the light went on then, It's not weakness to look past something or to choose in your heart to make a decision approximating forgiveness. The challenge then was, for the rest of the conference, trying not to reinforce her rudeness, but also not ready to crucify her for it either. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It's not a feeling. You still, if you've been offended in a deep way, you've been treated unfairly on a job, or you have, a wife, a husband has been unfaithful to you in some way, you may, for a long time, have that deep pain in your gut when you see that person or hear his or her name mentioned. You can still decide to take a posture of forgiveness simply because it's smart. It's smart for your mental health to do that. It's also, by the way, Jesus' way. You can choose to do that. It's not contingent on feelings. It's cognitions and behaviors that are most engaged with forgiveness. Pain involves feelings. Also, forgiveness is not automatic. People will say something like, time will heal it. Time will heal it. Actually, no. Time is the measure of distance between events. Chronology, chronos in Greek. It's just a measure of distance between events. Kairos, deep meaning in time, can help you change it by using steps toward forgiveness, approximating forgiveness. And if you have bitterness or hatred, the primary evidence that brings is that you still don't have the power. You're not in charge of it. Bitterness, hatred are signs that you're not in charge of it. I remember working with a young college student who was taking calculus, not doing well with it. And I said, well, how are you addressing the question? And he said, the teacher is a moron. She was a graduate teaching assistant. She's a moron. She's not clear. She doesn't speak English well. She's just an idiot. And I think her office hours are like 3 in the morning or something. She's not available. She's not helpful. Just, she's an idiot. So what he's doing is writing off calculus. And his first goal was to be an engineer. I was made to take calculus, and I went to the registrar and said, I don't want to do that. I just want to be a priest. He said, it'll make you a better priest. He lied. He lied. And I said to this young student, I said, just curious, what other decisions in your life is she making for you? He said, what? I said, well, you've put her in charge of no engineering career for you by writing off calculus. What else is she deciding about your future? Well, that worked, and the light went on for him, like, I'll show her. Fine, whatever motivates you. First step. It's not automatic. It's not going to just happen. You got to take some steps toward that direction. I remember working with a woman whose son was murdered. Her only son, only child, was murdered in cold blood. And long and short was she became The conviction took place quickly. It was clear who did it. She followed that trial. Every hearing, she was there for it. When he was sentenced to prison, she joined the prison auxiliary for the single purpose of learning who the mean pathological guards were. And she got access to the duty rosters so she could tell who was a mean guard on his cell block. This is over a period of time. And over that period of time, she lost her husband, who was very supportive in the beginning, but just couldn't live with that level of hatred. She also lost friends who were very solicitous in the beginning, but they tired of hearing the vitriol, the hatred coming forth from her. Pretty soon didn't spend time with her at all. And I said to her, I said, so when do you think about this guy? She said, all day, every day. I said, you're mopping a floor? You think about him? I think about him. I said, here's an invitation to you. The next time you're mopping the floor and you think about that guy and what he did to you, I said to her, I said, boy, he really harmed your family, didn't he? Yes. I said, my God, you probably can't think of anything worse than somebody murdering your only child. Yes. I said, it's probably occurred to you that you would have preferred that he killed you instead of your son. Yes. And she's looking at me like, you were the dumbest psychologist I ever met. Yes. And I said, why is he still in charge of your life? He's commandeering her waking thoughts. He's in charge of her life. The next task became, when he pops into your mind, we had rehearsed lots of pleasant relaxation scenarios. I said, just picture the door closing quietly in his face, not slamming it, clicking the door closed and saying, you're not welcome. You're not welcome. That's a major first step in forgiveness. Grudges are not smart. You pivot toward forgiveness. We talked about what forgiveness isn't. Let's talk about some steps for forgiveness. You don't start with, I can't forgive. You start with a desire that I'm doing the best that I can, and maybe one day I'll be able to forgive more easily. That's where you start. I'm doing the best I can. I'm choosing not to ruminate. I'm choosing not to steep myself in anger and bitterness. Those are bad for me. Those are poisons in my heart. I'm doing the best I can, and maybe one day I can approximate forgiveness. I remember a woman I was working with, her husband had left her for another woman who happened to be one of her close friends. And she said, very understandably, but she said, I hope she hates sex. And I hope he has a stroke. How about, let's just start with, I choose not to be concerned about whether he or she is happy. Just start with that. Teach yourself, I choose not to be concerned about whether they're happy. Not to keep the rumination going and the invectives. And ultimately, then the next step is, I wish him well, and I hope that he makes decisions going forward that don't hurt other people. I wish him well. Not happy about it. I wish him well, and I hope he makes better decisions going forward. and I'm moving on. And I'm moving on. That you choose to put your energy into positive stuff that you can control. You can't control what somebody else has done or said or is thinking. You can only control those three things for yourself. The key distinction is between accountability, and punishment. The big difference between those two. You know, because somebody has harmed you, you can make the decision to move on. I wish you well. I hope one day you come to whatever integrity you seek. I wish you well with that. Bless you on your way. It doesn't mean you have to, quotes, fix the friendship. It doesn't mean there's a license to come back to our relationship as it used to be. That's the difference between accountability and punishment. There are consequences to our behaviors. One of the things that I think is really an important point to make here is that you want to be really careful about forgiving behavior that does not change, like domestic violence or abuse of any kind. That's not behavior for forgiveness. That's behavior for you to take charge of how you respond to that without rumination, without bitterness and anger, but not behavior that reinforces behaviors that are heaping evil on other people. Not compatible. I can forgive you, but I'm still divorcing you. It's a big difference between accountability and punishment. Forgiveness is a choice. And it's a smart choice, not only by grace, because it's Jesus' way. Choosing to forgive. You know, like working toward that time when I can say, I forgive you. But you start with, I'm going to do the best I can. And I'm going to choose not to be consumed with what's going on for you. And moving toward, I wish you well. I wish you well going forward. I don't want to be part of that future, but I wish you well with that. To ultimately coming to the point where you can say, I forgive. Steps in forgiveness. It's theologically smart. Do you know what else? It's psychologically smart too. Forgiveness correlates positively, meaning those variables change together, with a decrease in depression. Rumination highly correlates with depression. You keep thinking the same negative stuff, you're going to keep experiencing darkness, downness, feeling depressed. When you take approximation steps toward forgiveness, that you're on that path toward forgiveness, it correlates with a reduction of depressive feelings. It's also, skills for forgiveness are essential for maintaining close friendships, romantic relationships, marriage, and parenting. The skills for forgiveness are essential to maintain those relationships, which are key relationships for you. Compassion and empathy are two virtues, two skill sets, is the way I choose to think of them. Compassion and empathy play a key role in shaping us toward forgiveness. When I was a young priest in Eugene, Oregon, I wondered, I was in my mid-20s, something like that. I wondered why it was that the pastor, who's 100 years old now, God bless him, why, he got all the funerals, and I ended up with a lot of weddings. Life experience teaches you why that is. He had much richer compassion and empathy for people's loss. I had it cognitively, and I had it theoretically. I thought I understood what that loss meant, but I had never lost anybody close to me. Makes great sense to me now why that was the case. He had walked that path with many people and had experienced that path himself. Empathy and compassion are essential in the progress toward forgiveness. And you know, Jesus knew that. In Luke 6, he said it. Be compassionate, just as your heavenly Father is compassionate. Be compassionate. Compassio. Compassio in Latin means to suffer with, but it also means to feel with. You can have compassion by really celebrating happy events in people's lives, just as you would have compassion for a sorrow or a loss that they might be experiencing. Those are major tools, and they are skills. It's a skill set that you can develop over time, choosing to be compassionate. And you know, if you weren't reared with great models of empathy and compassion, if you weren't reared with that, the great thing about being a human being is we are really resilient. We can learn stuff right to the end. And a great place to start is if I invited you to say, who do you know who's among the most compassionate people in your experience? When I say compassion, whose picture jumps into your head? Just break it down. What does she do? What does he say? What does he not do? What does she not say? How does she act in a way that manifests a sense of compassio, of feeling with somebody else? When you're watching the news, boy, we had enormous experiences that would invite us to this very recently here in the Valley. When you're watching those horrible stories coming out of the Santa Am Junction or the Estacada area or Lincoln City, whole blocks burned to the ground. You know, rather than just cognitively checking off, oh, okay, yeah, I know where that is. Gates, Lyons, Mahame, I know where those are. Think about that house they're showing you that's gone now, the rubble. My gosh, what must that be like to lose your home, to lose the photographs of your children, to lose memories, letters from your parents long gone to God? What must that feel like? What would it be like to have only the clothes on your back, everything gone? When you take the time to ask yourself those questions, you are steeping that skill of empathy. Having a sense, the best description I ever heard of empathy was from Carl Rogers, great American psychologist. Had the privilege to meet him before he died. An incredible man. The rap on his counseling was you had to be Carl Rogers to do Rogerian counseling. He said empathy is recognizing that you're in somebody else's shoes and never forgetting that they're not your shoes. That you're really present to a person's experience in a way that gives you the closest approximation you can without knowing what they're feeling. The least helpful words people speak to somebody else going through a difficulty. Oh, I know how you feel. Oh, I know how you feel. No, you don't. No, you don't. You might have a clue, but you don't know unless you are that person. Those two clusters of skills, compassion and empathy, essential toward forgiveness. One of the most difficult challenges in forgiveness is learning to forgive oneself. Learning to forgive oneself. For whatever that might prompt guilt, for blowing a marriage or being guilty of, not having done a good job parenting. Toughest job in the planet, beyond question, parenting. And you think back about that and you think, oh my gosh, what could I have done differently? To learn to forgive yourself. I came home when I was in my doctoral studies. I came home from the clinic one night. My parents were visiting me at the time. This is in Ottawa, Canada. I came into the apartment and my mother's in a rocking chair reading a developmental psychology textbook. And I said, what are you doing? She says, trying to see where we went wrong with you guys. I said, my lawyer is going to call you on that. It's like, whatever it may be, if you belittle the child or you mock the child, it seemed funny to you or, it just kind of came out of your mouth at the time, and you think about the damage that can do and, the harm that can cause a child. Not to beat yourself up for that. How do you deal with that? Here's some steps. Number one, first of all, get right with God, which in many ways is the easiest step. Get right with God. God, as the Pope said, never tires of forgiving us. That's one of the most beautiful things about our Catholic faith. We have multiple ways of experiencing God's forgiveness. Not just the sacrament of reconciliation, which is gorgeous on its own right. Every time we go to Mass, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. Do we think He doesn't hear us? Get right with God and have the humility to accept God's mercy. Secondly, when right and appropriate, it's not always appropriate, get right with the person you may have offended. I say it's not always right to do that. They may have gone on with their lives. They may have no interest in revisiting a painful memory that they may have. It's got to be appropriate to do that. And thirdly, learn from it. Perhaps most importantly, next to being open to God's mercy. What could I have done differently? What would have been a more helpful way to approach that situation? And fourthly, resolve to monitor your behavior going forward. Change what you can change. You're in charge of today. No future in yesterday. You can do something about today. Learn from it and move on. No rumination. A few words of conclusion. First of all, forgiveness helps us to be the best version of ourselves as Christians that we can be. Forgiveness helps us to approximate that beautiful goal. Secondly, all our efforts toward forgiveness unite us more deeply with Christ. All our efforts to forgiveness unite us more deeply with the heart of Christ. Thirdly, be lifted up by the forgiveness heroes in your life. The forgiveness heroes in your life. I can think of numerous examples of forgiveness heroes. Men, women, children who were really, really good at it. I want to close with a story, true story. It's the only advantage of getting old, I know. You don't ever have to make stuff up. Stuff happens, Some time ago, I was working in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with the clergy down there. And the bishop at the time, the archbishop, was a man named Jim Hayes. Great guy, wonderful man. And one day after the session with the priest ended, Jim and I were just going over the schedule for the next day and the agenda for that day. And after we just started to shoot the breeze. And he said to me, "Ray, do you know a sister of charity of Halifax sister named Sister Katie O'Toole?" I said, "No." I said, "Katie O'Toole sounds like an Irish pub." No, she's a nun up on the hill. They run a university in Halifax. He said, "She's a really good friend." He says, "You should meet her." I kept thinking, you'd really like Katie. You have a lot in common. You're a psychologist, she's a psychologist. You love to laugh, she loves to laugh. You're mentally ill, she's mentally ill. You guys that get along well. I said, "I'd love to meet Katie." He said, "Listen, I'll set it up. How about Thursday at noon for lunch? Can you manage that?" "Sure." So he said, 3 Fishermen Restaurant. It's a great seafood restaurant in downtown Halifax. So Thursday noon, there I am in the vestibule. No Jim Hayes. 5 minutes goes by, 7 minutes goes by. There's another woman in the vestibule whom I'd never met, obviously. She's looking at me. She looked at her watch. She walked over to me. If you have delicate ears, just plug them. She walked over to me and she said, "You know the bastard isn't coming, don't you?" And I said, "Do you mean His Excellency Archbishop Hayes?" She said, "That's the bastard. He's not coming." I liked her already. I'm not kidding. I thought we were going to get thrown out of the restaurant. Before the salads came, we were in ribald laughter. This is a really terminally funny person. Great lady. We did some workshops together just because it was fun to hang around. Great lady. She had been a missionary in Peru. She also had been the general superior of her religious congregation. She'd been around. She knew a lot of stuff. She was assigned to a group of Sisters of Charity down in Boston. They had a great street ministry to women and girls on the street. Did incredible work down there. While in Boston, Katie became ill, which is a very good place to get ill if you're going to get ill. There's some incredible medical centers in Boston. She had a type of lymphoma, I believe it was T-cell lymphoma. That's one that you should die with, but not from. And she was admitted to Brigham and Women's Hospital. It's one of the large hospitals in Boston, and it's under the Harvard Medical School umbrella. It's where they train oncologists and other specialties. And she agreed to go into a research protocol because it made her treatment free. She always thinks, nuns, right? She's thinking of the good for the community. We know now it's a double-blind study, as all decent medical studies or psychological studies are. Double-blind, so people don't know what cell of the study they're in or what exactly the purpose of the study is. She was assigned to a cell of the study that gave her maximum dose of chemotherapy based on her weight, her height, and her metabolism. Brought her as close to toxicity as they could ethically do, to see if it was more efficacious than the normal prescriptive. If you've spent any time around hospitals, you rarely hear peals of laughter on the oncology ward, but you would have had you been in Brigham and Women's when Katie was there. This woman had everybody laughing, nonstop. This one particular day, 2 of her sisters from her community were visiting her. That's how I know exactly what happened that day. She had them caught up in the banter and the laughter, and the oncologist came in to examine her and to administer her chemotherapy of the day. And he got caught up in the laughter and the back and forth. He reached behind him to the tray and picked up a syringe. Multiple mistakes there already. Picked up a syringe that had been prepared for a patient in another room who happened to weigh about 150 pounds more than Sister Katie weighed. And he just got caught up in the moment, and he administered the injection to her, and that's when he noticed the patient's name on the syringe. Heart-stopping moment, because he had just given her a lethal dose of chemotherapy. As soon as she metabolizes it, she's going to die. Half an hour, who knows? The physician was very much beside himself, completely distraught, as any of us would be too. And when he gathered himself, he said to Sister Katie, "My God, sister, I am so sorry." And he explained to her the mistake that he had made. Katie did two things. Listen to these two things in the context of our evening reflection, talking about the forgiveness heroes in our lives. The first thing Katie said to this doctor was, "Listen, it was a mistake. You didn't mean to do that. It was a mistake. Let it go. All it means to me is," quote, "I'm going to see my Jesus sooner," close the quote. Please don't stop practicing medicine. Don't stop your important research. Just let it go. The second thing she did, which probably came from having been the superior general of her congregation, she turned to the two nuns and she said, "Don't let our congregation sue this man, or the hospital, or the funding agency for this research. Let it go. Come pray with me." And she died. It's always hard for me to tell that story because this was a friend. And I was unable to go to the funeral mass for Katie, but I talked to Archbishop Hayes afterwards, who had said the mass. And he said, "You know, Ray, in all my years, that was the saddest funeral I ever did because of who she was and the circumstances of her death. And it was also the most joyful funeral I have ever done because of who she was." What a giant. What a giant. And you know, we all have those kinds of giants in our lives. Some a lot less dramatic than that, but nonetheless substantive. I've known a number of folks, women and men, and children over the years that were giants, heroes of forgiveness. That's part of the hundredfold that God gives all of us, that we can learn from one another, we can encourage one another. That's why the koinonia exists. We could pray all on our own, but we can't become the koinonia on our own. We're the community of God's beloved people, gathered around word and sacrament to strengthen each other, to encourage each other, to model for each other exactly what the Lord Jesus has given us to live. I want to thank you for coming out tonight. You made it a lot easier for me than talking to myself for the good people of Reno. So thank you very much, and God bless you all. Thank you.